Call of the Wild, Chapter 6, Part 2. Nobody spoke. Thornton's bluff, if bluff it was, had been called. He could feel a flush of warm blood creeping up his face. His tongue had tricked him. He did not know whether Buck could start 1,000 pounds, half a ton. The enormousness of it appalled him. He had great faith in Buck's strength, and had often thought him capable of starting such a load, but never, as now, had he faced the possibility of it. The eyes of a dozen men fixed upon him, silent and waiting. Further, he had no $1,000, nor had Hans or Pete. "I've got a sled standing outside now with 20 50-pound sacks of flour on it," Mathewson went on with brutal directness, "so don't let that hinder you." Thornton did not reply. He did not know what to say. He glanced from face to face in the absent way of a man who has lost the power of thought and is seeking somewhere to find the thing that will start it going again. The face of Jim O'Brien, a Mastodon king and old-time comrade, caught his eyes. It was a cue to him, seeming to rouse him to do what he would never have dreamed of doing. "Can you lend me 1,000?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "Sure," answered O'Brien, thumping down a plethoric sack by the side of Mathewson's. "Though it's little faith I'm having, John, that the beast can do the trick." The Eldorado emptied its occupants into the street to see the test. The tables were deserted, and the dealers and gamekeepers came forth to see the outcome of the wager and to lay odds. Several hundred men, furred and mittened, banked around the sled within easy distance. Mathewson's sled, loaded with 1,000 pounds of flour, had been standing for a couple of hours, and in the intense cold that was 60 below zero, the runners had frozen fast to the hard-packed snow. Men offered odds of 2 to 1 that Buck could not budge the sled. A quibble arose concerning the phrase "break out." O'Brien contended it was Thornton's privilege to knock the runners loose, leaving Buck to break it out from a dead standstill. Mathewson insisted that the phrase included breaking the runners from the frozen grip of the snow. A majority of the men who had witnessed the making of the bet decided in his favor, whereat the odds went up to 3 to 1 against Buck. There were no takers. Not a man believed him capable of the feat. Thornton had been hurried into the wager, heavy with doubt, and now that he looked at the sled itself, the concrete fact, with the regular team of 10 dogs curled up in the snow before it, the more impossible the task appeared. Mathewson waxed jubilant. 3 to 1, he proclaimed. "I'll lay you another 1,000 at that figure, Thornton. What do you say?" Thornton's doubt was strong in his face, but his fighting spirit was aroused. The fighting spirit that soars above odds, fails to recognize the impossible, and is deaf to all save the clamor for battle. He called Hans and Pete to him. Their sacks were slim, and with his own, the 3 partners could rake together only $200. In the ebb of their fortunes, their sum was their total capital. Yet they laid it unhesitatingly against Mathewson's 600. The team of 10 dogs was unhitched, and Buck, with his own harness, was put into the sled. He had caught the contagion of the excitement, and he felt that in some way he must do a great thing for John Thornton. Murmurs of admiration at his splendid appearance went up. He was in perfect condition, without an ounce of superfluous flesh, and the 150 pounds that he weighed were so many pounds of grit and virility. His furry coat shone with the sheen of silk. Down the neck and across the shoulders, his mane, in repose as it was, half bristled and seemed to lift with every movement, as though great excess of vigor made each particular hair alive and active. The great breast and heavy forelegs were no more than in proportion with the rest of the body, where the muscles showed in tight rolls underneath the skin. Men felt these muscles and proclaimed them hard as iron, and the odds went down to 2 to 1. God, sir," stuttered a member of the latest dynasty, a king of the Skookum benches. "I offer you 800 for him, sir, before the test, sir. 800 just as he stands." Thornton shook his head and stepped to Buck's side. "You must stand off from him," Mathewson protested. "Free play and plenty of room." The crowd fell silent. Only could be heard the voices of the gamblers vainly offering 2 to 1. Everybody acknowledged Buck a magnificent animal, but 20 50-pound sacks of flour were both too large in their eyes for them to loosen their pouch strings. Thornton knelt down by Buck's side. He took his head in his 2 hands and rested cheek on cheek. He did not playfully shake him, as was his wont, or murmur soft love curses, but he whispered in his ear. "As you love me, Buck, as you love me," is that he whispered. Buck whined with suppressed eagerness. The crowd was watching curiously. The affair was growing mysterious. It seemed like a conjuration. As Thornton got to his feet, Buck seized his mittened hand between his jaws, pressing in with his teeth and releasing slowly, half reluctantly. It was the answer in terms not of speech, but of love. Thornton stepped well back. "Now, Buck," he said. Buck tightened the traces, then slacked them for a matter of several inches. It was the way he had learned. "Gee!" Thornton's voice rang out, sharp in the tense silence. Buck swung to the right, ending the movement in a plunge that took up the slack and with a sudden jerk arrested his 150 pounds. The load quivered, and from under the runners arose a crisp crackling. "Ha!" commanded Thornton. Buck duplicated the maneuver, this time to the left. The crackling turned into a snapping, the sled pivoting, and the runners slipping and grating several inches to the side. The sled was broken out. Men were holding their breaths, intensely unconscious of the fact. "Now, mush!" Thornton's command cracked like a pistol shot. Buck threw himself forward, tightening the traces with a jarring lunge. His whole body was gathered compactly together in the tremendous effort, the muscles writhing and knotting like live things under the silky fur. His great chest was low to the ground, his head forward and down, while his feet were flying like mad, the claws scarring the hard-packed snow in parallel grooves. The sled swayed and trembled, half started forward. One of his feet slipped, and one man groaned aloud. Then the sled lurched ahead in what appeared a rapid succession of jerks, though it never really came to a dead stop again. Half an inch, 2 inches. The jerks perceptibly diminished as the sled gained momentum. He caught them up till it was moving steadily along. Men gasped and began to breathe again, unaware that for a moment they had ceased to breathe. Thornton was running behind, encouraging Buck with short, cheery words. The distance had been measured off, and as he neared the pile of firewood, which marked the end of the 100 yards, a cheer began to grow and grow, which burst into a roar as he passed the firewood and halted at command. Every man was tearing himself loose, even Mathewson. Hats and mittens were flying in the air, men were shaking hands, it did not matter with whom, and bubbling over in a general incoherent babble. But Thornton fell on his knees beside Buck, head against head, and he was shaking him back and forth. Those who hurried up heard him cursing Buck, and he cursed him long and fervently and softly and lovingly. God, sir, spluttered the Skookum Bench King. "I'll give you 1,000 for him, sir, 1,000, sir, 1,200, sir." Thornton rose to his feet, his eyes were wet, the tears were streaming frankly down his cheeks. "Sir," he said to the Skookum Bench King, "no, sir, you can go to hell, sir, it's the best I can do for you, sir." Buck seized Thornton's hand in his teeth. Thornton shook him back and forth. As though animated by a common impulse, the onlookers drew back to a respectful distance, nor were they again indiscreet enough to interrupt.